We are going to move on to clip number 3. We're going to talk about forgiveness. I'm watching the clock. Don't worry, 8:28. We're going to be done. Clip number 3, if you're on Zoom, JLS 2023, that's the code you're going to need later. Clip number 3, the brothers expressing remorse. We're going to talk about forgiveness and bring this all together, particularly in the family context. Clip number 3, the brothers forgiving Joseph and kind of having remorse about the old Canaan days.
It's funny, but since we lost
Joseph, we've gone to see ourselves.
perhaps the old misjudged the lad. Perhaps he wasn't quite that bad. And how we miss his
entertaining dreams.
Those Canaan days we used to know, where have they gone? Where did they go?
Where did those days go? And they end up coming back together, and he forgives them, they forgive him. In the past, last year, we talked about with Karen Kessler, who's here, we talked about apologizing and the proper way to apologize and the right way to stand before God. Next week, I'll hate, forgive me, forgive me, forgive me. We're not talking about apologizing tonight. But let's talk a little bit about forgiveness and the role forgiveness has to the client in a family dynamic or otherwise, when an attorney would recommend or suggest to their client that they forgive someone that had caused them harm or hurt them in some way, and when that's counterproductive. We'll start with Kurt.
So I'm going to disagree with something you just said, which is that it's not about apologizing. I think almost everybody in this room has had a dispute where you knew if your client or the opposing party just said, "I'm sorry," the whole thing would have been resolved. I'm sure if you put a show of hands, everyone would say I absolutely had that scenario. And so I have a situation right now with 2 family members who own a very successful business, pulling, same thing, millions of dollars a year. There's some dispute between them that goes back 30 years, and they're not speaking to each other, and it could literally be resolved if one would go to the other's house, give a hug, and the other one would say, "I'm sorry," it'd be over with. Instead, they're going to spend hundreds of thousands of dollars fighting. And it's about ego, a lack of empathy, misconception, misperception, all the things that go on when people are just literally talking past each other. And so, you know, at the end of the day, the ability to forgive, I think, requires a tremendous amount of self-awareness. It requires empathy, the ability to sort of see the bigger picture, understand the other person's perspective. But it also requires, in most situations, you know, it's very rare that one person's 100% right and the other person's 100% wrong. So it's very rare that you have forgiveness without an apology. "I'm sorry, I forgive you." And judges would have a lot less to do if people could just step out of their situation and say, "You know what? I get it. I'm listening to you. I understand what you're saying. I understand why." That's one thing I always emphasize within our firm is before you jump into what is, you know, how to fix it, you have to understand the why. What is going on beneath this? And if the people who are in the dispute can understand why they're in the dispute, why they're feeling a certain way, and actually dig into it, this is the part where you play psychologist, they get to a resolution. But it's the minority. They'd rather just fight and kill each other.
So 2 brothers are fighting, you're representing one of them, and your client comes to you and he says, "You know, my brother came to my house, he gave me a hug, he said he's sorry. Should I forgive him and drop the litigation?"
Rabbi?
It's a very interesting thing. You are required in Jewish law, if you think the other person is sincere, you are required to forgive them. It does not mean, though, that you have to drop the litigation. No, in other words, if real damage was done to you, their statement of apology, if it's not willing to acknowledge the damage, and we're talking about a meaningful financial damage, and if they're not willing to acknowledge it, so why would you have to? So I would separate the two prayers. You know, one of the popular siddurim in Jewish life is the Art Scroll Siddur. How many? I'm not going to do any more questions. You were saying, I know every hand would go up. I would like to have seen if that would happen.
Enough with the surveys. Right?
Okay, so you know, many of you are familiar with the Jewish tradition that the last words you're supposed to say it now are the Shema Yisrael, those words. In Art Scroll, though, the Shema that you're supposed to say at night is 8 pages. The idea being that by the time you finish, at least you'll be able to fall asleep. But in any case, one of the prayers there was clearly a Kabbalistic prayer, which is supposed to say every night before you go to sleep, Hareini Mochel, I hereby forgive anybody who hurt me, whether in this way or in that way. And what's fascinating, and the reason we know it's a Kabbalistic prayer is, Bein begilgul zeh, bein begilgul acher. It then says, I forgive them whether they hurt me in this incarnation or in a previous incarnation.
That goes back to mindfulness.
But if you go back to the prayer Hazakah, the Chayei, the prayer you're supposed to say before Yom Kippur, it's very clear. You can forgive somebody without letting go of your legitimate claim against them. In the same way, I'll give you an example, totally outside of Jewish life. If you remember, a man named Ali Akka tried to murder Pope John Paul II, and he got sentenced to prison, to life in prison. And the Pope eventually went to visit him and forgave him, but didn't ask that his sentence be reduced. My wife worked for 12 years as a translator, editor, and all-around assistant to Isaac Bashevis Singer. And she remembers when that happened, Isaac said, of course he forgave him. He had to. He's the Pope. You know, no Jew, I think, would have thought that you had to forgive somebody if they didn't ask for the forgiveness. But obviously, I very strongly urge people to forgive where it's destroying them. I'll just give 2 very brief examples. I remember Harold Kushner tells of there was a woman in his congregation whose husband had deserted her, had mistreated her, and then she couldn't get alimony. And he said when her anger against him was so great, but 11 years later, it had passed, but her anger was still as strong as ever. And he said to her, you've been carrying around a hot poker in your hand for 11 years, and all you've done is burn your hand. You know, you're not going to be able to do it. And the late Abraham Twersky, alav shalom, told me Twersky's main area of contribution, he did a lot of work against addiction, and particularly with alcoholism. And he was speaking to a recovering alcoholic who said, the problem for a recovering alcoholic is that first drink, because they can't control themselves once they start drinking. And the guy said, when am I most apt to be tempted to drink? When I'm really angry at somebody and I really feel I've been the victim of an injustice and I have a grudge. And he said, I learned that carrying around a grudge is like allowing the person in the world whom you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. And that's ultimately what I would say is the case here. Carrying a grudge is like allowing the person in the world who you most dislike to live in your mind rent-free. What better advice can I offer before Yom Kippur?
Kurt,
Forgive
and then we
me.
want to hear from the judge on this.
Right, well,
Forgive you. You are forgiven. You are forgiven.
This is a question that either could answer. I think, Rabbi, what you're saying is that an apology and forgiveness implicitly also require some form of restitution. Mm-hmm. I mean, one without the other either lacks sincerity or the depth of forgiveness that you want, because without it, it's sort of hollow. I mean, as you made decisions in cases, and I think we talked about this when we were on the Zoom call, and I said when a litigant would say, I'm sorry, or I feel badly, express remorse, and I said, how often did you believe they meant it?
Well, I think when it comes to sentencing, for example, in a criminal case, remorse is sometimes a factor the judge would officially consider certainly in the federal sentencing scheme. In the state scheme, I hate to say anything in front of these Supreme Court justices, but I would say it's more questionable whether it's properly before the court as a factor. Nonetheless, a lack of remorse wouldn't be necessarily the appropriate thing to display to a sentencing judge. It's something the judge is concerned about recidivism and whether the individual is going to repeat the behavior. And remorse does seem to, if it's genuine, which of course is extremely difficult to figure out, points in the direction of not repeating the behavior. But one thing I wanted to say about apologizing and continuing to litigate is that very often the grievances that people feel against each other fuel litigation that is not financially reasonable. So one thing one has to consider in litigation is the cost of the litigation, both the cost in dollars and cents that you're paying to the lawyer and the cost in energy and time. And in my experience, litigation impedes forgiveness. It interferes with forgiveness because you are gearing up, you are stressed out, you are not in a calm, benevolent mood vis-a-vis the other party. And you see this a lot in divorce cases. And a major problem is if there are children and young children who are going to be traveling back and forth between parents who cannot forgive each other, cannot apologize, and the litigation steams it up and makes it worse and worse and worse. So there are many, many reasons why, whether it's true forgiveness or not, at least turning down the temperature and not having that person living in your head rent-free, but rather, just like a minor grudge or something like that, a historical grudge. It is better, way better for the children, way more cost-effective, and just a way to enjoy the rest of your life rather than spend it, with such unhappiness.
I guess the middle of the road would be when forgiveness leads to a settlement. That would be blending all of these ideas
Anything that
together.
leads to a settlement, I'm in favor.
Right.
Well, Rabbi, to that end, it's very few family litigations that go to trial that when you get an outcome from the trial, that anyone is satisfied with the outcome. Because it never resolves the underlying issue that got them there in the first place. And settlement requires internalizing and accepting the outcome as an alternative to something else. So, and I think that's an important thing, is that, as we guide our clients, to fight to the death, and it's an issue when you want to get paid as counsel, and they didn't get every penny they thought they were entitled to from their brother, sister, mother, or they didn't think the family member didn't suffer enough. They never leave satisfied. And then, of course, if you're owed a bill, they then want to partner up with you and say, and I'd like to talk about how this could have gone better, and so let's talk about a compromise. So another reason why you try to guide them through settlement and the satisfaction with the outcome.
Beautiful. Wrapping this all up, I'll give each of the panelists, and thank you so much for your participation. This is really, really engaging and inspiring and wonderful. Bringing it all together. It is, as the Attorney General said, a time of the year that's most appropriate for this type of event, an opportunity, an evening to think and explore and really reckon with some of the ethical dilemmas that challenge us, that inspire us to do better, to be better. Judge, last thoughts on the topics at hand?
Well, I just really don't have any great wisdom to impart, but just to say that...
Humility and modesty.
But it's been a pleasure to participate, and I really appreciate your ability to make it go in such a congenial and thoughtful fashion.
Kurt, give us a little.
I don't know what more I could add to that.
Thank you.
It was just a pleasure to be here, to be honored by serving on this panel with these very esteemed colleagues, and just thank you for having me.
So, Rabbi, we'll let you have the last word. Bring it all home for us.
Okay, two brief.
8:26. I'm watching.
Okay. I'm going to start speaking very quickly because I have to get a few. No, okay. Two very quick thoughts. I had a Rebbe at YU, Aaron Kreiser, who before Rosh Hashanah, there's a very well-known passage in the Talmud that the first temple was destroyed because people committed the worst possible offenses, murder, idolatry, adultery, and the second temple was destroyed because of causeless hatred. He said, nonetheless, the first temple was rebuilt in 70 years. The second temple hasn't been rebuilt. He said, why? He said, because when people do something really terrible and then bad things befall them, they realize they really did do something terrible. But people who did causeless hatred never think that they did anything wrong. They can always justify their hatred. So to the extent that any of us can think of an undue animosity that we can maybe let go of, let's do it. And my second thought was something my son Benjamin wrote years ago in a column. He says, the Torah notes that Joseph recognized his brothers, but they did not recognize him. There is a lesson here for all of us. Even when Joseph seems to be gone, he may actually be dwelling in the very person to whom you are speaking. Just have an awareness of what it means that the other people also are creatures in the image of God, and just be really conscious of it, and that can affect our behavior greatly.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank you, Judge. Thank you, Kurt.